As you probably have recognized, I have a scientific background and an interest in psychology. And trying to marry these two together, as you can tell from the conference, is a really complex, interesting task. And I wanted to bring it back today to some of the definitions that I had to go through in order to come to a place of understanding why I'm doing this. And so I've got some illustrations that I've drawn on from the backgrounds of science, and hopefully you'll be able to relate to some of these as we go through. These are alchemical images, and I know Carolyn's certainly aware of alchemy, and most people are aware of what alchemy is in general, but there's a vast literature of alchemical images and alchemical texts that I think that are sort of the origins, but also the origins of the science, but also can shed light on some of the discussions that we're having here today. And I'm hoping that this will bring us back to some sort of basic discussions and talk about the interface of science and some of the issues that were raised this morning in the very eloquent presentations. So what is science? If we go back to basics, it's essentially the idea of observing nature and through identification, description, and experiment, understanding what is nature. But as we've done this, and as David so eloquently spoke last night, the scientist has objectified nature. We try and pull ourselves outside of nature, and so we cease to relate to it in a certain way with that passion, perhaps. And then we develop this thing called the scientific method, which is a way of trying to understand what's going on with nature. On a very simplistic level, science holds everything constant and changes one variable. Well, if you look at global warming, it's essentially the exact opposite. Everything is varying all the time. Climate change is a dynamic process. So science has had to sort of change its perspective recently to try and encompass these different dynamics. Science is considered impersonal. Scientists look for causes. And I was talking with Melanie. Her idea of a scientific conference is for people to come in and give their 12-minute speech and sit back down with their laptop and sort of move on. There is no real interaction. So for a lot of scientists, this kind of meeting is very different and requires people to move out of their traditional scientific persona and interface. I really like this image. This image is from 1556 and gives you sort of a hint of what's to come in the future.
Where is it from? Agricola?
De Re Metallica.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Agricola. De Re Metallica.
Yeah. Agricola, right. Yep. So we've heard the word shadow used today, and that's a word that I'll come to, but it's essentially, to define it, Jung said that this is, the shadow is where we put things that we don't really want to recognize, that we don't really want to face, that we want to kind of avoid if we can. And we've heard a lot about technology, and I was really interested with Galen's dream that she presented, that even in the unconscious of this individual, there is a rocket that is firing up into space. And that reminds me of some of the discussions that I've had with Jeff and others about the technological fix that's currently being banded around for climate change. And that's an interesting connection to me, where people are having images in the unconscious that reflect what is also being banded around in science. So science has its own language, the graph, the equation, the acronym. This is called the Invisible College of the Rosicrucians, and it's done in 1618. And sometimes science is a little like this. We have our own institution, and we're separate from everyone else, and it's a center of learning and discipline. And the idea of the guild comes to mind. And the conversation yesterday I thought was really interesting, because there's the people within the guild in England, where I grew up, who would like to keep it the same sort of tradition that it's been, where science is kept sacrosanct. It's housed in a building like this with all of the people doing their own thing, somewhat disconnected from the world. And yet the real science that I think is important is actually the interface between the scientist and the public. And that's the area where I think science needs to move. So if there's one message that I'm trying to get across in this, we need to approach science in a very different way. And there are a lot of people here who have embodied interdisciplinary work. And I think scientists, and we need to teach science at a very early age to try and do the same thing. Embody a different perspective, something that incorporates rather than sets up guilds that separate. There are a couple of other issues that I think are pretty fundamental. One is the idea of funding, selective funding. You know, most of the science is done through grants. Who funds those? Who decides on those? Where does the money come from? We had some great suggestions come out of the conversation so far. How do you fund that? You know, and I think that's an important aspect of this whole thing. The peer review process. You know, there are stories about scientists who have great papers, but they aren't backed up by the theory of science, and so they may be rejected because they are not based in pure science or good science. And so now we get this subjective evaluation of what is good science, what is bad science, what is junk science. And I think every scientist who's been educated in these institutions feels that they should not be doing junk science. The other thing that I think is interesting is that science is driven by this thing called the null hypothesis, which I'll get to in a minute. This is called Der Alchemist by E. von Hove, 1883. And I think kind of illustrates how science perceives itself. So what is this idea of the null hypothesis? Well, we ask the question, we make the statement, there is no relationship between X and Y. Well, that means that some people believe there's no such thing as global warming. So there is no relationship between climate change and the intensity of hurricanes. Okay? A lot of scientists would say that that's actually true. The public might believe that it's a myth. They might believe that climate change is a myth. So what is a myth? Come down to some definitions here. False belief, widely held but mistaken. A fictitious personal thing, something fictitious or non-existent, but whose existence is widely believed in. An ancient story about heroes, super beings. Myths are groups of stories, creation myths, and they're also an idealized concept. And all of the above can be applied to science. And I'd like to dwell on this a little bit because I think it's really important to understand in the collective understanding, the psyche of the people who are out there in the world, how does science fit in? So we heard a story, and I was going to use it as an example of the discovery of the structure of benzene, where a scientist, Kekulé, had a dream of snakes chasing their tails. And that's a good example of an ancient story that has been sort of made its way into the collective knowing of everyone. The same is true of the discovery of penicillin. You know, we go back to the picture of the man with a beard, and he's leaning over, and all of a sudden he can discover that here's a new experience that he's able to observe that ultimately helps humanity. We have the idea of myths of the creation of the universe. Well, there's now the battle raging between the Big Bang Theory and the evolution or the creation of the universe. Idealized concept. This image is from the Apollo 15 mission, and I was really impressed by the NASA websites where they have the documentation of all the images of the moonwalks and the moon landing. And this has been evoked a lot throughout the conference. People can land on the moon. Well, if we can land on the moon, we can do anything. This is the myth of science in the psyche. Incredible photographs, incredible images of people being in a different place. False belief. The world is flat. This one I think is really important also because there are collective beliefs that people hold on to even though they may in fact be incorrect. but because they've infiltrated into the language and they've infiltrated into the media, everyone kind of believes them. And I think climate change is one of those that there needs to be a way of trying to get across that this is not a false belief, this is actually real. And then this one that scientists can change the weather. People are sort of latching onto this as a technological fix for the problem. And I perhaps argue that that's a myth. You know. Here's another image. This is called The Cosmological Glass by William Cunningham, 1559. And for me, this sort of illustrated C.G. Jung's definition of the archetype. We've heard that word bandied around a lot. What is an archetype? And I wanted to again bring it back to the pretty basic idea that this is just a collective idea. It's a pattern. There are essentially patterns of human relationships. There are patterns in life that everybody knows exist. And that's all they are. There are patterns of instinctual behavior, feeding, reproduction, and there are patterns of spiritual behavior. And I think your presentation this morning illustrated how we're trying to bring these two together. We're trying to understand the relationship between instinctual and spiritual behaviors, and I think science fits right in there. The other thing that I think is interesting is we can kind of universally relate to this image. You know, probably yesterday afternoon you were feeling a bit this way. So here we are, we're talking about the environment in the world, and yet which we are in, but we're also carrying it. So here's a paradox. And I think that this is also an interesting paradox for what's going on with this conference and what's going on in the world right now. We have reached a point where the world has become so small that this exists. And this is done in the 1500s. Here's another image that has been bandied around a lot. Mother Earth, here she is, feeding her young. You see, this is from Atlanta Fujins by Michael Meyer, 1617. And it's another representation that I think the psyche's picked up on. You know, people have used this idea of Mother Earth feeding her young. Myths had a purpose, a ritual purpose, a religious purpose. There's a book out called When They Severed Earth from Sky by Elizabeth and Paul Barber, which is a mytho-linguistic approach to the environment, to nature. And their thesis is that myths were in fact a way of conveying natural events. And this was before we had written language, and so the experience that I had with your presentation is one of being drawn in by the shaman. You know, and here's a description of your experience of nature. And I think that myths served the same purpose, and it reinforced and gave us information about how nature worked. So, they offered meaning, they provided perspective, they infused a relationship with nature, and they relaxed anxiety around natural events. And I think that's also very key. I think what's happening now in the culture is people's anxiety around natural events are building, and we don't have a myth to really help relieve some of that anxiety. And I think conferences like this will ultimately develop images and stories that will help to do that. There are lots of myths around nature, and I'm just going to give you 3 ideas. I'm not going to go into the myths in detail, but the story of Gilgamesh and Enkidu is a Babylonian early myth, and these two cut the forest down. They went into the sacred forest and they killed its keeper and cut the forest down. And they represent, again, these 2 ideas. One is instinctual. Enkidu was an instinctual being, whereas Gilgamesh was more of a spiritual being who created cities. The myth of Erisikathon is really interesting. This man had so much narcissism, as we would say in the psychological world, and felled the sacred tree of Demeter. For this, he was visited by hunger, an insatiable hunger. And this insatiable hunger led him to sell his daughter. And the gods helped the daughter, and she changed form, and he kept finding her and selling her over and over again, and ultimately consumed his own body because of his insatiable hunger. And again, I'm not going to interpret these. I'm just going to leave them out there as sort of an image, and hopefully you can kind of relate and get a sense of where they're going. Carolyn mentioned the Demeter and Persephone, which is a very important myth in the psyche. Hades came in, took Persephone to the underworld. Demeter mourned her loss, her anger, turned the world to winter. Persephone comes back with the sun, and this represents the seasonal cycles. We can all relate to the seasonal cycles. And this became a very important myth and essentially a worship of the feminine, which is another aspect that I think is running through what we're doing, but not specifically mentioned, except perhaps by Karen. This myth is designed to bring us back to the present and talk about the relationship between science and myth. I was walking through the grocery store, and I heard the term duck and cover. Well, I'm from England. This means nothing to me. But I was thinking, duck and cover, what is that? And then I'm sure it means something to pretty much everyone in this room, right? So if you look at what is that myth, you may even be very familiar with these images, and may have even practiced this ritual, a sacred ritual, duck and cover. So what is the science behind this? There is a scientific story that we all know, and I think relates a lot to the previous myth. Nuclear suns and nuclear winters is a very real possibility. And one of the things it brings up for me is, can we draw analogies from this example that we can use today? Can we come up with a clock that represents the climate change problem? Can we put this image, the image of climate change, in this perspective? Is there a myth that we can tell now that would be the equivalent of the duck and cover? And I know that that's a theme that's been running through this whole conference. So, on a more optimistic note, this is from Splendor Solis, 1708, and is at the end of the series, and sort of shows that, maybe we can have a relationship with the sun. Maybe there is a way that we can ultimately work it through so that we can come up with that myth, move it forward. And I think it comes back to scientists and science being part of the solution, not just identifying the problem, okay? Scientists have a passion about science. I think my observation is that working with nature, scientists develop a relationship. And a lot of scientists have become very concerned because they've spent their life focusing on a particular issue, and it's become very important to them. And scientists generally look for relationships in the science they do, and I think this spills over to build relationships in the people they work with, and also to look for relationships with other groups. And that was one of the key themes, I think, of this conference is, how can we build those bridges? But that requires the scientists to look outside their own world. This is l'atmosphère météorologique populaire, 1888, and really represents the idea of how can we change the perspective of science? How can we get people to look beyond their own small world? Again, a lot of people in this room sort of embody the solution here, which is to do multidisciplinary approaches, phenomenology, hermeneutics, weight of evidence. Do we absolutely have to have every single piece of the jigsaw that fit together? I thought that was a great image. the jigsaw that fits together before we can actually get a sense of what the picture is going to look like. And can we engage in the process? And I also think that scientists embody if they do this right, a personal heroic story. There are lots of people who make an effort to step outside the collective boundary of science in order to communicate a different message. Now, I do a lot of public meeting work, and I feel like that's one of the key areas where science fails, is that it takes a personal effort to stand up in front of a lot of people and make a statement about science, because it's not the way that scientists are trained at the moment. Perhaps that needs to change. Perhaps there needs to be a different perspective that's much less narrow. So, bringing psychology into this, what is the shadow? Well, it really is asking the question, why can't we grasp that our actions have consequences? What is that psychologically that blocks that? Externalization. How can we dump things into the environment and have no concern? Now, Freud and other psychologists have come up with a series of different words, denial being one of them, that are psychological defenses. And I think it's important to evaluate what are these defenses, because there is evidence out there that we should be aware of. And then that brings us back to relationship. Okay, this image, which I thought was kind of interesting, is the practice of the new and old physic, 1599. And I thought this was another interesting image of the science's approach to some of the climate change issues. I'd like to just begin to close on one other myth, which I won't interpret, but this is the story of the son of Helios, or Apollo, the sun god. And this young man was the son of a nymph and didn't know who his father was. And then he found out that his father was, in fact, Apollo, and he wanted to go and meet with his father, as all young boys do. And he so admired his father, and his father was so pleased to see him that he said, I will grant you a wish. And the son wanted to be like his father, and he said, well, I want to ride your chariot across the sky. So Apollo said, I don't think that's a good idea. But ultimately relented, and he did let him ride the chariot across the sky. And of course, the young man was unable to control the power of the horses and the sun. And it came down too close to Earth, scorched the desert. People were dying. The horses became unruly, and they moved too far away from the Earth, and the Earth cooled down, and people were dying from the cold. And Zeus was looking on this, and he said, I got to do something. So he sent a thunderbolt down, and he killed Phaethon, who fell from the chariot. And when he died, his sisters mourned. They sat by a river and cried. And as they cried, they slowly turned into trees, and their tears became jewels of amber. Again, I'm not going to interpret that. I'll just leave you to think about it for a while. And so, are myths even relevant today? Can we get anything from them? Is there anything in these old stories that would be useful? The problem that I see with science in the collective comes back to this idea that if we can land on the moon, we can do anything. The ancients believed that their actions or prayers could influence the gods. I think people have the same idea about science. I think that they are often convinced that because we can land on the moon, we can pretty much do anything. There's a collective reliance on science and technology in the same psychological way that the ancients would believe that those myths were real. And then what I'd like to do is close with this sense of how do we bring things together? This again is from Splendor Solis, and this is the image of a hermaphrodite. And I actually prefer this image to the joining of Apollo and Hermes. This is hermaphrodite is derived from Hermes and Aphrodite, and is a combination of masculine and feminine. And there are lots of images for this in alchemy, including the rebus. And as you can see, this being is holding an image of the world. So we have science, which has this attention to detail, a focus on fact, and following the collective patterns of the scientific process and often the scientific institution. And then we have nature, which is a relationship to other, a focus on feeling, individual experience, and a sense of mystery. And at some point, and I think that's what needs to happen, is we need to bring these together early in the mind of the scientist. We need to be able to come up with a strange blend that educates scientists to relate in a broader context. And I would challenge the educators we have here to help facilitate that process so that scientists are not just these single lines of evidence, if you like. So I thought this image was not only a good image for bringing together masculine and feminine, science and nature, different sides of the brain, but also is how I kind of feel as a scientist and a psychologist trying to meld these different practices, which often look very different, but I believe at their root core need to be brought together and are compatible. So with that, I'd like to do that.